Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Some massive news coming out of the transfer portal Wednesday morning as former five-star safety, freshman All-American Caleb Downs from Alabama intending to hit the transfer portal. And I think for a lot of college football fans that follow the recruiting trail closely, follow the transfer portal closely, have a good feeling about how this might play out. And that is Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs already emerging as the team to beat for Caleb Downs if he does, in fact, enter the portal. And the way I look at it is this highlights a conversation that I don't think is being had enough in terms of what this coaching hire of Kalen DeBoer to Alabama, really how it impacts the SEC. And what I'm looking at is Kirby Smart and probably licking his chops in terms of what he can start to do on the recruiting trail over the next couple of years. And you follow recruiting, you follow the recruiting battles. I mean, for the top talent from the southeastern United States, there's normally two contenders for those guys, and that's Georgia and Alabama. And as Nick Saban leaves Alabama, I think Kirby Smart recognizes an opportunity to really kind of grab a stranglehold in terms of recruiting this part of the United States and, quite frankly, on the recruiting trail in general. I mean, almost every five-star that's coming out of high school is coming down to Georgia and Alabama. And with Nick Saban not at Alabama, I think this represents a massive opportunity for Kirby Smart to really get a lot of traction as if he hadn't already on the recruiting trail. And the one question you had about Kalen DeBoer and the hire that Alabama made was not how good of a football coach Kalen DeBoer is, right? We know his overall record. We know what he can do from a schematic standpoint, especially on the offensive side of the football. The question that we have is how well can he recruit the SEC landscape? And I think Kirby Smart sees that hire and, quite frankly, smells blood in the water. And you saw when that contact period opened, he was ripping through the state of Georgia, made, I think, 8 visits to 8 different high schools across the state. If you're a Georgia fan, if you're Kirby Smart, you go and grab T-Rob from Alabama staff. This is, over the next couple of years, a massive opportunity to really gain an edge on the recruiting trail. And I think Caleb Downs hitting the portal, considering the Georgia Bulldogs, really does highlight that. So I want to talk about Caleb Downs, what he brings to the table. And if you're an SEC fan, you kind of know what Caleb Downs brings to the table. He's a phenomenal football player, but more have the conversation about, I mean, what is the SEC conference going to look like on the recruiting trail over the next couple of years? Before we get into it, just want to say thank you to you guys. It truly has been a blast over the last couple of weeks covering the transfer portal, covering the high school recruiting trail. You guys know this is probably one of my more favorite parts to talk about college football is roster construction and recruiting. The amount of support you guys have shown really does mean a lot. So if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, I want to get into this conversation. And that is, I think you're going to see a little bit of a shift in the power vacuum in that SEC conference, specifically on the recruiting trail. And if you've been following college football long enough, you know winning college football games, winning national titles, winning SEC titles largely starts on the recruiting trail. And you look how the recruiting trail has played out in the SEC for the last 10 years. Really, since Kirby Smart has taken the job at Georgia, Nick Saban has been at Alabama. And it comes down to Georgia and Alabama largely having a strong hold on the SEC and on the recruiting trail. And I think a lot of guys who are committing to Alabama committed to Nick Saban, not necessarily the program of Alabama, but the Nick Saban development, right? You walk down that hall, you hear the stories all the time of Nick Saban walking these recruits down the hall and saying, these are all the players that we've put out into the NFL during my tenure at Alabama. That was a huge selling point for a lot of these kids coming out of high school, and no doubt was a huge selling point for Caleb Downs. And so with Nick Saban no longer at Alabama, one, that hurts its recruiting in and of itself. Whoever they decided to bring in, I don't think was going to recruit at the level Nick Saban was, right? Because the proof was always in the pudding. You go to Alabama, you have a very good chance of being drafted into the NFL. That narrative is starting to shift over to Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. But even with the hire of Kalen DeBoer, it makes the question of Alabama and how well they're going to be able to recruit an even bigger question. Right, I think there's stories of a lot of these top guys, Caleb Downs probably included, taking a little less NIL money to go to Alabama because they were confident that going to Alabama was going to put them into the NFL. And with Nick Saban not being there, I don't think that I've heard it called the Saban tax. I don't think that many of these guys are going to go to Alabama for a little bit less. And so now where does their attention start to shift on the recruiting trail? It starts to shift to the program in Athens that has been putting out NFL talent like nobody's business over the last couple of years. And so Caleb Downs hitting the transfer portal, I think, highlights the conversation that we're going to see on the recruiting trail, which is these young talent coming out of high school are looking at the programs that are going to put them in the best spot to go to the NFL, put them in the best spot to win national championships, to win SEC championships. I think there's the no-brainer answer to that question. And that is what Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs are building in Athens. So getting into Caleb Downs, what he brings to the football field, I think a lot of people probably are familiar with Caleb Downs. When Nick Saban talked about Caleb Downs, you rarely see Nick Saban get giddy about players. And Caleb Downs, his eyes lit up. Caleb Downs played over 890 snaps as a true freshman for the Alabama Crimson Tide at that safety spot. 70 tackles, 2 interceptions, 3 passes defended, only missed 11% of his tackles. Caleb Downs, as a true freshman at the SEC, was largely one of the best, not only freshmen, but players that we saw in college football. And he's now intending to enter the transfer portal, looking at the other programs that are going to give him the best chance to get developed, win national championships, win SEC championships. I think the answer is relatively obvious for a guy like Caleb Downs. I think he's going to go to Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. We'll see how this plays out, but I think it kind of highlights maybe a trend that we're going to see over the next couple of years. And we have a couple other guys that I want to talk about that probably fit this trend, but Caleb Downs hitting the transfer portal, I think, highlights what we're going to see over the next couple of years, and that is the top talent that Alabama and Georgia were used to competing for. That competition, if you will, between Nick Saban and Kirby Smart is going to be skewed over the next couple of years to the Georgia Bulldogs and Kirby Smart. Another guy that, I think you have to reference in this conversation is a guy like Justice Haynes, right? 5-star running back coming out of Buford in the 2023 year one, dealt with some injuries, played a little bit in the college football playoffs. Justice Haynes is going to be an absolute dude at the college football level. Flashed as a true freshman going into year 2. You feel pretty good about that. It came down to Alabama and Georgia for Justice Haynes as well. He ends up going to Alabama. I wouldn't be surprised if you see Justice Haynes hit the transfer portal too. And who do you think is going to be the program that is going to be trending for Justice Haynes, just like it is for Caleb Downs? It's going to be Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs. And you could even have this conversation with the guys that are right now in the 2025 class, right? You saw Mason Short, who was committed to Alabama out of the 2025 class, a very coveted interior offensive lineman who absolutely looks like a house. He decommits from Alabama. What does Kirby Smart do that day? He took a visit to Georgia this weekend, and then when he decommits from Alabama, Kirby Smart gets in the helicopter, lands on the football field of Mason Short's high school, and takes a visit to the school. That's the type of stuff that Kirby Smart does on a consistent basis on the recruiting trail. And the question is, can Kalen DeBoer match that tenacity on the recruiting trail? Because now you have Kirby Smart, who is probably the hardest working recruiter in all of college football. He already is selling probably the premier brand in college football in terms of you want to come win an SEC championship, a national championship, and go to the NFL. That was already trending in Georgia's favor before Nick Saban even retired at Alabama. Now it's much more in his favor. This is another example of, I think, Kirby Smart showing that he's going to have a stranglehold on this talent that's coming from the southeastern United States. And so I think you look at how this plays out the next couple of years. And again, I don't want to get up here and talk about Kalen DeBoer like he's a bad football coach. Anybody who's watched college football knows Kalen DeBoer, from a schematic standpoint, is one of the best in the game. That's why he got the job at Alabama. But the question that you do have is how well he can recruit. He didn't recruit very well at Washington, even though they had 2 of the best seasons in program history. He brings over much of his staff from Washington, which also was not a very good recruiting staff. He loses a guy like T-Rob to Georgia. That is a massive player in terms of recruiting the defensive side of the football. You start having these questions about how well can Kalen DeBoer match the talent acquisition of a guy like Kirby Smart over the next couple of years. And I'm looking at it and saying, I don't think he stands a chance. And so although Kalen DeBoer is a phenomenal football coach, I think the Georgia Bulldogs are going to have a massive leg up on the talent acquisition department. And we all know, we've all been following college football enough that that's where it starts. Yes, you need to be able to develop players. You need to be able to scheme up an offense and play and know the X's and O's of the sport. But it really does start with, can we have more physical freaks than you guys have? And at this point, you're looking at it and saying, I think Kirby Smart is going to have the leg up on the talent acquisition department. You're going to see a lot of these top players from the high school ranks who are considering Alabama and Georgia. I think that competition for those talent, those recruiting battles, are going to be going Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs way. And I think for Georgia fans, you see Nick Saban leave, you're already smelling blood in the water. I think with Kalen DeBoer taking the job, with having very little or zero experience recruiting this area of the country, with how well Kirby Smart recruits this area of the country, I think you're going to see Georgia winning a lot more recruiting battles than you saw them with Nick Saban when he was at Alabama. We'll see how this plays out. This was immediately kind of my thought when Kalen DeBoer took the job. And I think you're starting to see it play out with guys like Caleb Downs hit the portal, Mason Short decommitting from Alabama, probably trending to Georgia. For Georgia fans, this is going to be a really exciting next couple of months on the recruiting trail. You expect Kirby Smart to really capitalize on it. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. Wanted to hop on, not only talk about Caleb Downs and how good of a football player Caleb Downs is, but more importantly, highlight the fact that I think Kirby Smart is going to start to roll on the transfer portal over the next couple of years. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys. We'll continue to update you guys as the commitments and as these recruitment battles play out. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.